This little tiny thing is actually good. But just how good is it? Let's find out over the next few minutes. The Aiyima A80 is, at its core, an integrated amplifier with a DAC. Or maybe it's a DAC with an integrated amplifier. It's one of those all-in-one products where basically you just add a pair of speakers, connect your phone via Bluetooth, and you have a complete sound setup. But it's also much more than that. Let's start with the build quality. The aluminium chassis gives the A80 a premium feel that you wouldn't normally expect at this price point. The display is functional and offers various animated view meter styles, but personally I would happily trade those animations for a cleaner information-focused mode showing only the active input and signal data in a larger and more readable way. It includes optical and coaxial SPDIF inputs, USB-C, Bluetooth, analog RCA, and TRS inputs. It becomes fairly obvious that there simply wasn't enough room left for proper XLR connectors without violating several laws of physics. TRS stands for tip ring sleeve, referring to the three contacts of the connector. In this case, they are used for balanced signal transmission, allowing better noise rejection and integration with audio interfaces, professional DACs, or more advanced desktop setups. You can connect virtually any balance equipment here, although since very few hi-fi components actually use this type of connectors, there's a good chance you'll soon find yourself online at 2 AM searching for female XLR to TRS adapters. Aiyima refers to this input as being for a decoder. I believe they mean something like a sound interface. They can also be used to connect a mixing desk. In this case, I actually connected a mixer with balanced TRS outputs, proving that while the A80 is perfectly capable of professional audio duties, the same cannot necessarily be said about my piano playing. Now, before this accidentally turns into a piano tutorial channel, it's worth mentioning that the A80 is actually surprisingly versatile when it comes to connectivity. As for outputs, it has speaker terminals and a mini jack output that can be used for an active subwoofer, active speakers, or as a pre-out. Personally, I would have preferred proper RCA connectors instead of the mini jack output, because this output actually proved to be surprisingly capable as a pre-out. I also tested the A80 connected directly to a power amplifier and my Copland setup, specifically to evaluate the DAC and preamp stages. And I have to say, it performed rather better than I was expecting from something with a mini jack output. At this point, having already used the A80 for things it probably never expected to be doing at this price point, I connected it to my Windows 11 laptop via USB. The A80 was automatically recognized as a USB audio device and simply worked. The USB connection actually sounded very good, outperforming SPDIF in overall clarity while also supporting higher sample rates and resolutions. But moving back into more traditional hi-fi territory, I also tested the analog RCA input using my Eversolo A6 streamer, and this was another pleasant surprise. The sonic character of the A6 remained completely intact, which is not always the case with integrated amplifiers in this price range. I've tested analog inputs on other devices that slightly changed the sound character, but the A80 simply passed the signal through without noticeable affecting it. And then we arrive at Bluetooth, the feature most people will probably use constantly, while audiophiles continue pretending they won't. However, here I did notice a certain compression effect, with the sound becoming slightly more congested. But that's perfectly natural considering the limitations and compression involved in this type of interface. Oh, and before I completely forget about it, the A80 comes with a remote control. Where is this thing? It's so small. Here it is. Although I should mention that the button layout appears to have been designed according to a logic system I haven't entirely decoded yet. Several times I attempted to adjust the volume and accidentally altered the bass instead. Still, considering the price, the inclusion of a proper remote control is actually quite impressive. Now, despite my ongoing confusion with some of the remote buttons, one thing Aiyima absolutely got right was the mute function. Instead of abruptly, sometimes I struggle with some words, sorry. Instead of abruptly blasting the music back at you, the volume fades in smoothly and progressively. A small touch, but one that actually makes the A80 feel more refined than its price would suggest. Up until this point, we've mostly been talking about buttons, connectors, and my ongoing disagreement with the remote control. But the real story of the A80 actually begins inside the box. The A80 uses an ESS Sabre DAC chip, a highly respected DAC solution widely used in the hi-fi world. This chip is not exclusive to budget equipment. It also appears in dedicated DACs and products from well-established brands, often at significantly higher price points. So, despite the A80's low price, the digital to analog conversion stage is technically solid. On the amplification side, we find the Texas Instruments TPA3255, a very popular and capable Class D chip, although it's important to put its specifications into proper context. This chip advertises very high power figures, but those numbers are achieved very close to its limits, where distortion can rise to around 10%. In practical and realistic terms, the clean operating zone is probably somewhere around 30 to 60 watts per channel. This clean zone may vary depending on speaker impedance and sensitivity, but it shouldn't be far from those figures. Beyond that point, distortion starts becoming more noticeable, and the sound can lose some of its openness, becoming flatter and slightly compressed. But for normal listening levels, the A80 has more than enough power for a typical room or desktop setup. After all, it managed to drive my Tannoy, which is slightly unfair, considering the poor little thing probably cost less than one of the Tannoy spikes. One particularly interesting feature on the A80 is the possibility of replacing the internal op-amp. The unit comes fitted with a socket that allows easy op-amp swapping, opening the door to a certain level of sound signature customization. For people who enjoy this kind of experimentation, it's a genuinely interesting feature and one that adds real value to the package. In my case, I happen to have a few compatible op-amps available, so naturally curiosity took over and I started swapping chips to evaluate the sonic differences introduced. Now, all of this technical stuff is interesting, of course, but let's be honest, nobody buys an amplifier to admire the op-amps. What really matters is the sound. Here the A80 did something I wasn't entirely expecting. It threw out a seriously impressive soundstage, good width, good depth, and a presentation that felt far bigger than this little amplifier has any right to produce. The overall sonic character turned out to be very pleasant and actually reminded me somewhat of the old Denon PMA 60 series amplifiers, of which I own the three models, the PMA 560, 860 and 1060. A sweet and musical presentation. Detail is present, and there's enough transparency to perceive the acoustic environment of recordings. There's also a slight sense of presence in the upper mid-range that helps vocals cut through the mix more clearly and gives percussion attacks a bit more definition. Treble extension is actually quite good as well, although in my system I thought I could detect a very slight grain. Then again, Tannoy super tweeters are not exactly known for being forgiving. The mids are a touch dry, but still smooth and enjoyable, while the treble stays sweet and non-fatiguing, with enough extension to keep things sounding open and detailed. Bass is round, weighty, impressive for this price range. Naturally, it doesn't reach the very deepest low-end extension of much more substantial amplifiers, and of course, it's important to keep things realistic here. We're talking about a tiny, compact amplifier, not one of those gigantic power amps that requires its own piece of furniture. Dynamic range is also surprisingly good. No, it doesn't quite deliver the same scale, impact, and contrast as my main reference system, but considering the size and price of the A80, it honestly performs remarkably well. It still manages to preserve dynamic swings convincingly and keeps music feeling alive and energetic. As a DAC, and because the overall sonic character was already proving surprisingly convincing, I became curious to hear how much of that performance was actually coming from the DAC section itself. So I also tested the A80 strictly as a DAC, connected, in this case aux out, into my main system. And the result? The sonic signature remained the same, only now with the additional power and control delivered by the McCormack amplifier. That demonstrates two things. The DAC section has genuine quality, and the A80 Class D amplification is transparent. Comparing the A80 DAC directly to my benchmark DAC, I still prefer the benchmark overall, although the differences were honestly far smaller than I expected. And it's also important to mention that the connection between the A80 and my Copland preamp was made using a fairly basic mini jack to RCA cable, which realistically is probably not the ideal scenario for extracting the absolute maximum performance from a DAC section of this quality. And that brings me once again to the same conclusion. The A80 really deserved proper RCA pre-outs because the DAC section itself is clearly capable of more than that little mini jack connector might suggest. Because once connected to a more powerful amplifier, the A80 opens the door to a surprisingly serious upgrade path by allowing it to function purely as a DAC preamp. And things become even more interesting when you start experimenting with op-amp rolling. In my case, the op-amp swap introduced a noticeable improvement in soundstage dimensionality, while also giving the overall presentation a slightly warmer tonal balance. I used a pair of op-amps with the marking scratch off, which I removed years ago from a preamplifier I once owned. I believe they may have been Analog Devices chips, although I cannot say for certain. So after spending quite some time listening to it, testing it, swapping op-amps, pushing this little thing far beyond what its size would suggest, quite frankly, I don't think the Aiyima A80 has any right sounding this good at this price point. And for many people, it could very easily become the center of a truly enjoyable hi-fi system in the medium-sized room. Now, to be fair, although figures close to 300 watts are advertised, in real-world listening, if you actually care about maintaining sound quality, usable power is probably more realistically somewhere in the 30 to 60 watt range. But honestly, unless your long-term plan involves upsetting the neighbors or triggering structural concerns in nearby buildings, that is more than enough power for normal listening. And that really is what makes the A80 so impressive. It's simple, compact, versatile, surprisingly refined, and delivers a level of sound quality that feels comfortably above what its price would normally suggest. Within the right system and with realistic expectations, it becomes extremely easy to recommend. So, congratulations to Aiyima for creating a genuinely impressive little amplifier despite the occasional identity crisis involving mini jacks and remote control buttons. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.